Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Read All About It, How to Get Your Stories into the Media. My name is Susan Smith and I'm Editor of News Services at the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations. We have a great panel of speakers for you today who can answer all your questions about the best way to get coverage for your charities. I'll just introduce the speakers before we cover some housekeeping and get on with the Q&A. First up, we have Chris Clements from BBC Scotland. Chris has worked across digital print and broadcast journalism for over a decade. He has been BBC Scotland's The Nine's social affairs correspondent since it launched in 2019. We also have Nicola Gunn of the Edinburgh Dog and Cat Home. Nicola is Director of Development and External Affairs at Edinburgh Dog and Cat Home. She's worked in fundraising and communications in the Scottish charity sector for over a decade, and she'll have lots of insight into the best ways to promote your organisation. And we have a slight change of plan as Jolene Campbell from the Edinburgh Evening News is self-isolating with her young daughter, so couldn't make today's webinar. So Gareth Jones from Third Force News has kindly stepped in. Gareth has got a wealth of journalistic experience. He's worked across local and trade newspapers and magazines for over a decade. Before joining Third Force News in 2016, he was a senior reporter at the Stirling Observer for 4 years. So before we start, just to let you know that all webinar participants' lines are muted throughout the event, so you won't be overheard. There is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and please do submit any questions that you would like the panel to answer live. We've had quite a lot of questions submitted in advance, so we may not get through them all. So if there are ones that you see that you particularly want to be answered, please do upvote them, and we'll try to get the ones at the top answered first. The webinar is being recorded, so you will be able to watch it again after the event, and it will be available on the SCVO website. So let's just kick off our discussion. I asked our panelists to have a wee think about their perceptions of Scottish charities and how well they do at getting media coverage. And I'll start with Chris, who could maybe give us his perceptions and any thoughts he has on what charities are doing well or could do better. Chris.
Hi everyone. By and large, most charities are quite proactive in getting in touch with news desks and things like that. But it doesn't mean to say that the timeliness of it is a big issue in terms of, so some are very good at getting in touch way in advance, particularly if it's a broadcast piece that they're wanting to promote, whereas others are not so good, so they'll maybe kind of give you a day's notice, and it then means that you're having to scramble around and try to figure out how to tell a story for television. I think one of the things that's probably useful for organisations to know is to really understand what an organisation, a news organisation might be looking for. So, for example, if you are wanting to promote work that's done on the ground for a voluntary organisation that's doing something like helping older people with loneliness in a particular part of Edinburgh or Glasgow or something, it'd be quite important to kind of get in touch with either an individual reporter or journalist who you think might cover that story. And there are loads of ways to get their details, either via Twitter or even sending it into asking for them via a news desk or a commissioning desk, and understanding what they might require for every single story or for a story that you might do. So that would be things like, what could you film? Are there any real people, which is not to say people who work for charities are not real people, it's case studies, service users, that kind of thing. And also whether or not there are any volunteers on the ground who are willing to talk, because often I find that people who are at the front line of a charity are often the most interested and engaging and passionate. So it's also good to make sure that you have someone in your organisation that could be someone on the ground talking about the kind of work that you're doing. And also have an understanding that things don't always work. Things that might work in newspapers might not always work for TV or radio. So if you have a story that you need to get out for in the newspapers, it's a lot easier. Speaking to somebody who worked at the Daily Record and various local newspapers for quite a while, it's a lot easier for us to turn the story around. Whereas, as I said before, in broadcast terms, we do need that wee bit more planning if we're going to make something that's a bit more impactful and makes a difference and gets a lot more attention.
Thanks, Chris. Those are some good tips. Gareth, you are working for Third Force News, which is digital and print at the moment. Are there anything different, or you've got obviously a lot of experience of charity comms?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to kind of back up what Chris said to start with, really, it's all about thinking about your audience, who you're pitching your story to, and when you do that. I suppose unlike broadcast journalism, if you send us something 2 or 3 weeks in advance with an embargo on it, unless it's something massive, it's probably going to go back towards the back of the queue. So quite often it's actually better not to send us stuff too far in advance unless it's something really big. But just pick up the phone and have a chat with us as well. TFN can quite often cover stories that other sort of print outlets wouldn't cover, especially stuff like new members of staff, things like that. We're always looking for stories. I think that organisations have adapted quite well generally to the coronavirus. Sort of initial fears we had about not getting any pictures and things like that haven't really come to fruition. And organisations like Nicola's have done really well in being honest and sort of highlighting the seriousness of the issues the sector faces. I think in the past the sector's been a wee bit sort of risk averse and worried about sort of stating the truth. But I think that's something that's kind of good that's come out of this, is it's all right to say that things aren't all right for an organisation. So that's been one of the kind of positive things of it. And I think going forward, it's just kind of continually thinking about what it is you want to talk about in terms of the immediate sort of issues that your organisation faces. But also I think there is a desire there for news that isn't related directly to COVID. So if you've got nice little stories that are about different issues, that are about regular kind of issues that you would face, then that's nice as well. So there's always lots of news in the charity sector. It's just telling it in the right way, really.
Thanks, Gareth. That's great. And Nicola, you obviously don't work in the media, but from a charity point of view, how important do you think media coverage is? One of the reasons, I should say this right from the start, that we invited Nicola to this webinar is because Edinburgh Dog and Cat Home have just been doing a fantastic job of engaging with their supporters and keeping their profile high during lockdown. And so far their Help Our Home campaign has raised 160,000, which is really, really impressive, particularly because recent stats have suggested that animal charities are not really high on people's priorities at the moment in terms of giving at the moment. So they've done a really, really good job. So Nicola, how important was the media and media coverage in that?
Yeah, I think for this campaign in particular, the media were really important, and throughout COVID, the media have been really important for us because as Gareth said, we've been putting a lot of messaging out there this year about how the pandemic's affected us and the seriousness of the financials of it. And I know that most charities have faced the same thing. And I think it's that transparency. People can see when you're not being transparent as an organisation. I think the more honest you can be, obviously you need to keep things confidential. It needs to be confidential, of course, but the more honest you can be with the media and with people that support your work, the better, the more that they're going to want to support you. I think from the media point of view, it's always a case of asking yourself why you want to get a certain message out there before you actually just send a press release out and hope for the best. Actually have a think about what you're wanting to say, who you're wanting to say it to, and think about the demographic. So one press release you send out might not be the same to the same audience as another. If it's a fundraising campaign, for example, then have a look at your database. If you're lucky enough to have a database, do a bit of data crunching, find out who those supporters are, and look at what media outlets really reach that demographic and help you reach those people. But at the same time, you might be wanting to put out a message that you want to reach as far and wide as possible. Then, of course, that might be where you kind of reach the bigger, more national media centres. So yeah, I mean, media is kind of one piece of the puzzle for us. We do a lot on social media, we do a lot of marketing, and we also do some paid advertising as well. So I'd say it's one part of the jigsaw puzzle, but a really important piece because obviously it's free. and it can get your message out to a whole new audience. So yeah, hugely important for us at home.
Thanks. We'll hear a little bit more about some of these other things, because I know although this webinar is focused on how to get your stories in the media, the people who are here will also be interested in some tips on social media and how to tell their story themselves, I suppose, through other digital marketing and other ways. So I'm just going to kick on with some of the questions, just as a reminder that you can submit questions through the Q&A function on the webinar. If you submit them on the chat, I probably won't see them. So if you do have a question for the panel and you want to answer, if you can submit it through the Q&A function, then I will try and get it answered. But I'm just going to jump in with one of the questions that was submitted in advance, which is quite interesting, which is that for Gareth and Chris. Gareth, has coronavirus changed the way you gather news, and are you relying more on social media than you did before?
I don't think it's not changed it massively. My kind of career started about 12, 13 years ago, something like that. Social media was already a thing then, and it's just upped and upped since then. A lot of news gathering these days is done through social media. But to be honest, the phone would go quite a lot, but it tended to be prior to the coronavirus pandemic, it tended to be people running things by us or checking that we got a press release by email. Most of our correspondence comes by email now. We do pick up stories on social media as well. It hasn't greatly changed. As I say, we had kind of fears that maybe we wouldn't get as many pictures and things like that, but actually we've been getting sort of the same level that we got before. I would say it hasn't greatly changed. Obviously, we can't go out and meet people, but equally, I think we've been able to kind of speak to different people than we would through using software like this. So I think the first couple of weeks, we probably didn't have as much contact with people as what we did, but generally now I'd say it's round about normal, really, just in different ways.
Great, thanks, Gareth. And Chris, what about you? Do you use social media to source stories, or do you depend on people getting in touch directly with you?
Social media is a very, very important source for myself. Usually what tends to happen with social media is we'll get in touch, I'll identify an area. So for example, if there's a subject that's particularly relevant for that time, so it could be, so a great example I'm thinking of is we did a thing on the care review, which was a big, it was a big look at the care system in Scotland, and Scottish Government had commissioned this huge inquiry into it. And beforehand, we needed sort of case studies and examples of as to the services that are out there. So what the sort of stuff we do is we would go through social media and look for things like, relationship groups. One of the ones that we got in touch with was a charity called Siblings Reunited, I think it was called, and that was basically a privately run, a small charity in Fife, which basically existed to put young children in care in touch with each other, siblings in touch with each other, and provide a safe space. And we found that through social media. Things like people who are potentially an example of a particular policy, or people who are at the sharp end of a policy, we'd find them via social media as well. They might be talking about it on Facebook, they might be talking about it in local Facebook groups, like support groups. You've seen a lot of them springing up over the pandemic. But in terms of how the pandemic's affected how we work, it's changed a lot of things for us. It's much more difficult to get to people. It's much more difficult because we need people in front of a camera talking to the camera rather than talking to us over the phone. And it means that we've had to rely on things like video technology like this. And often what I find is that isn't often the best way to demonstrate or tell a story. But one of the big things that has been really good, and I think a lot of charities could maybe take some note of this, is that user-generated content has been massive. So charities filming things themselves, people documenting their lives in lockdown, that sort of thing has been invaluable for us in being able to tell the story of coronavirus in particular. But I think that'll also help us adapt the way going forward how we're going to be able to tell ordinary people's stories and the stories of charities and organisations as well. So yeah, it's been very difficult for us to adapt, but I think we're sort of getting there. The stories are still happening out there, but it's just the sort of trying to get to people and things like that it's proved to be a bit more difficult, a bit more challenging.
Yeah, that picks up on a question that I was going to ask you later, and something that's been submitted really about, you know, if you get an email coming through that's got photographs and video attached, are you thinking, yes, this is a winner? Were you thinking that before COVID, or are you thinking, oh no, this is probably going to be rubbish and we're not going to be able to use it? You know, how do you feel about that?
Well, from my perspective, I mean, in news, when I worked in newspapers, yes, it was a winner because it meant that we didn't have to go out with a photographer and things like that, and we had something that could potentially illustrate the story anyway. I'll be perfectly honest, if something comes in to me in a press release that has pictures attached, I'll be interested, but it might not necessarily be something that I would use for broadcast or for online. We'd probably prefer to go out and get our own stuff. But that's me particularly. It's not a hard and fast rule for everybody that works on my side of things. So you know, it definitely helps, I think, and I wouldn't advise anybody to stop doing it, but it's not the be all and end all for me anyway.
And Gareth, I'll come back to Nicola in a minute, but just on this part issue about pictures, are you more keen to see a picture attached, and have you got any tips for what you want to see in that picture?
Yeah, definitely. I think the majority of print outlets need a picture for anything to be used, certainly online, and there's very few pieces in newspapers these days, apart from the odd wee kind of column down the side that won't involve some sort of a picture being used. If you can avoid getting a stock image, then that's great, because if you've got pictures of actually what your charity does, and if they've got a couple of images, then that's absolutely great. That tends to be the things that work best. And just to kind of talk about stock images for a few seconds, it's very difficult for us to select stock images on stories if someone hasn't sent an image. It can be, sometimes the issues can be quite sensitive, and it's always a difficult one for us to kind of think about. So even if you've got suggestions around the type of image that you would like used for your story, then that's certainly a good thing as well. But yeah, pictures are an absolute must these days for anything in terms of the kind of newspaper, so to speak.
So Nicola, does that ring true for you? Are you always trying to get good photographs, and do you employ professionals to do that for you so that you can submit those?
I think we're incredibly fortunate working in animal welfare that our beneficiaries are cute dogs and cats, so it's very easy to get those images. And no, we don't tend to pay for photography where we can do it in-house. Now and again, if we need something professional for our website or a piece of marketing, then perhaps, but we have a lot of kennel and cattery members of staff with really good camera phones that tend to take those photos anyway on a day-to-day basis, because obviously we're putting these dogs and cats up for rehoming and need those images for that. But I appreciate from previous jobs in the sector, not working in animal welfare, how difficult it can be to get images, particularly if it's of beneficiaries, because a lot of the times you're telling very sensitive stories or talking about very sensitive areas of work. So I think it's just important to remember getting your permissions, all of that kind of thing. But it's also building a relationship with your operational teams, and that can take a long time. Especially if you're a fundraiser, but comms as well, sometimes you're seen as a bit of a necessary evil within your organisation, and it's building those strong relationships and helping your team that are delivering your service to understand why you're there and what you're doing. And that might take a bit of time, but if you get them on board, then they tend to be able to help build these relationships between and bridge the gap between you and the kind of beneficiaries to be able to get good images and good stories and get those permissions. But I appreciate it can take a lot of time, and if you're remote as well, if your fundraising comms office is based away from where your service delivery happens, that can be quite tricky as well. But I'd say be patient and just keep building those relationships internally, and that tends to help with the kind of imagery and the videos that you need.
And so back to the original question, which was about social media and news gathering. Have you found journalists approaching you more over the last year, or do you still feel that you have to be the proactive one?
No, definitely. I mean, particularly over this year where 2/3 of my team have been on furlough. So we've, at times we were working with 3 or 4 members of staff across fundraising communications. So we were actually really limited on what communications we could proactively put out there, and had to kind of really pick and choose what we had the time to do. And we actually found that a lot of journalists have been getting in touch with us via Twitter messages and emailing us and calling us when they've seen something that we've put up. So actually it makes you think some things that we wouldn't have maybe thought were newsworthy that we'd put on our social media actually were newsworthy. So it's taken a step back actually and thinking before you post something on social media, actually, could this be newsworthy, and could we put out a quick press release or send a quick email to see if a journalist might pick this up.
And another quick question that was submitted in advance, it sort of picks up on that a little bit, which is about whether the press release is dead. Chris, what do you think about press releases generally?
I don't think the press release is dead at all, actually. I think it's a really, really good and helpful way to succinctly tell people what the story is and what people need to know. And I think that it's also a really easy to digest way for a news desk to see it and go, right, I know what this is, and they can pick out the kind of key points that they know will be of interest to their readers or their audience. So I have no issues with press releases at all. In fact, yeah, long may they continue. That's all I would say. But yeah, it's getting the press releases to the right people, I think, is a major issue, rather than blanket approach and send it to everyone in an organisation. As I said in my first answer, identify the journalists that you think might be the type that would go for this story. That might be a particular correspondent or a particular person who has a role in the area that your charity perhaps works in, or indeed just send it to the central commission in our news desk, and people there will pick it up and they'll assess it and then put it out to the general reporter who'll deal with it. So that's press releases are okay.
Great. And Gareth, how long should a press release be? How do you feel when you get a 3-page press release in?
Personally think that you should keep it to about 500-600 words, and if there's longer than that, then link in documents, policy briefings, that type of thing. It's quite daunting if you see a press release and you can scroll down for 2 minutes. It's quite difficult to sort of it takes longer to digest what's in there than one that's really succinct. And just to go back to what Chris is saying, and I think this is a theme that we'll keep going back to today, it's all about your audience. It's all about, if you've got lots to say, think about different ways you can say that, and think about different people who'll be interested in telling that story, rather than just going for 3,000 words. And I know that sometimes press releases are prepared by committee, and that chief executives or board members or whoever want certain paragraphs added, but just as the person who's responsible for the communications, just try and kind of bring them back to saying, is this absolutely vital to be in there? Is this something that we need to be in there? Or can we use another way to get that information in there, such as a hyperlink or that type of thing?
And we've had quite a few questions submitted about case studies as well. So Nicola, I think you were kind of touching on this when you were talking about those internal relationships. And I noted from looking up your LinkedIn profile before this that you used to work for the children's hospices across Scotland, which I imagine is a particularly difficult one, working with children with life-limiting conditions in hospices, who are, quite understandably, a lot of families and carers are going to be nervous about them being used in the media as case studies. So what are your top tips for creating a case study?
Yeah, case studies are probably the most important thing you could have in your comms kind of weaponry. because telling a story is going to be far more impactful than stats and figures, which have their place, of course, but those stories are so important. And yeah, it goes, I think it 100% goes back to that relationship with your service delivery team. Because if you look at an example of Chaz or similar charities, actually there might be families that really do want to tell their story, but you need to trust that your service delivery team actually know if that's right or not, because they might know that yes, they want to share their story, but actually they might be vulnerable at the moment, and that might not be best for them. So I think it totally goes back to having that strong relationship and that trust, and showing your service delivery team that they can trust you with the stories as well, but also showing them the impact of when you've put a good story out there, what's been the result of that, feeding that back to the team and saying, like, actually that story got all this press coverage and brought in this much in donations, or whatever the kind of KPIs behind that have been. But yeah, I think also, as you'll all know, but I think it's important having those policies in place internally as well, those safeguarding policies, your comms policies, so that your beneficiaries are protected. You don't want to exploit your beneficiaries for the sake of your charity, but equally their stories are so important. So I think it's just having all those internal processes right. But 100% goes back to that strong tie between comms, fundraising and service delivery, and the trust that you need to build. And it takes time. I'll keep saying that, but you need to be patient. It can take a lot of time.
Great, thank you, Nicola. Chris, how important is it that you get access to the case study yourself? Or, you know, if you receive something in that might have a photograph or a video and some information about the case study that a staff member has written up, is that good enough, or do you need to have access?
No, we wouldn't. Well, I wouldn't run anything without speaking to the person themselves. Not because we don't trust the charity, but it's just good practice. So you're checking things out yourself. You're making sure everything is bottoming out, because there might be a bit of information that the charity has admitted or omitted, which is actually very important. So it could be anything, and it's not because we don't trust the people in the charities. It's just making sure that due diligence is done. But case studies are I can't stress this enough. They're vital to helping a reader and an audience understand why they should care about a story, why they should care about the work that a charity is doing. And also, I mean, obviously there's a whole thing about protecting the needs and protecting the people themselves, but they also have a bit of, well, many, I imagine most of them do have agency themselves, that, you know, they may, as Nicola says, they may want to share the story, and that gives them the opportunity to share the story. But and it gets back to this thing about showing the audience the impact of an organisation's work rather than telling them about it. So if there is this great work that's been done at ground level that is really making a difference to someone's life, let's see what that looks like, and let's see what how that's impacting on their well-being, rather than having somebody saying, "Oh, we're doing all this great work, but we can't show you it." Also, I mean, the thing is, I would say is you have to sort of trust the journalists as well, because it's not in the journalist's interest to exploit or get it wrong. They would want to make sure that it's as accurate as possible, and they would want, and you know, from my perspective, I never want to do a story with someone's vulnerable and perhaps shouldn't be on the telly telling a story. This is the stuff that we take very seriously at the BBC. We've got quite a lot of sort of informed consent rules around informed consent. So as a person able to give consent to do the interview and all that. So we have our strict processes regardless of what the charity does. And also, I mean, if there is a case study or there is a person who's benefiting from this and the story is particularly powerful, let us know well in advance. The charity, the journalist will all be part of the discussion that's ongoing, and it helps us get the trust of the case study and helps us get the most out of them being able to tell their story. So it's absolutely vital that, you know, real people are involved in these types of stories, and the sooner that we have contact with them, the sooner we are able to get to know them and to build trust with them, the better the story is going to be, and the more impactful the story is going to be.
Great, thanks, Chris. And Gareth, obviously you're coming at it from a slightly different perspective because you're coming at it from print. So from your point of view, are you quite happy with a case study that's been written up and submitted by the charity?
Yeah, certainly. It all depends on the quality and how it fits for the rest of the piece. I think that we need to remember that for the voluntary sector, case studies are actually what everything they do is all about. It's the people that at the end of the day that most organisations are set up for. So if you've got a really good example of that and it's ready to go, then certainly we can carry that. I think there are times when organisations need to use unnamed individuals or people who've had their names changed, kind of anonymous type stuff. Generally, if you can avoid that, that's good. If you can actually have somebody who's pictured and who's willing to kind of come forward and tell their story, that's the best way to do it. But yeah, certainly ready-made stuff generally works quite well, albeit we'd usually kind of at least speak to the organisation that sent it through and tweak it a little bit and have a look at it, see if there's there might be the other wee questions we want to ask as well. But yeah, it can be a really, really good addition to sending an email through if you've got a ready-made case study.
Great, thanks very much. So I'm just going to move on to one of the upvoted questions, which this is the pot of gold, I think, and it might not be that easy to answer, but what is it that makes a story newsworthy? Gareth, do you want to try and tell us that?
Yep, certainly. Well, I think just starting straight away, it's the headline or the title of the email that's sent through. If you send something through that says, I don't know, welcome to our charities AGM, and you're actually launching a drive to save the charity, then we're less likely to pick that up if the first line doesn't relate to the story you want to tell. So having an intro in there that's good as well. The headline in the intro or the email title in the intro are really, really important. Sometimes a few little lines to kind of summarise what it is you're trying to say and why that's important is good as well at the top of an email. And the other thing is just picking up the phone. Even just now, we're all available by the phone. I'm guessing most newsrooms can be contacted. Run the story by someone, see what they think, see if they think that is a story for them. And if it's not this time, then don't let that put you off trying again in the future as well. Because just because your story doesn't get the pickup that you hope for this time, it doesn't mean that 3 months down the line you're not going to have something really, really good.
Yeah, thank you, Gareth. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, I would just echo exactly what Gareth said there. Just making sure that it's something that, I mean, an AGM, for example, would not be something that a news organisation would be interested in because it's quite processy. I mean, I can't imagine a reader who isn't invested in the charity or that subject being particularly grabbed by that kind of thing. So yeah, it's really about that you know, being able to explain the story, what it is quite succinctly and why it matters, I think is the main thing. Obviously there are other factors including severity, scale, the people who are, for example, if there's a really strong case study attached, keep going back to that. But that sort of thing is also likely to get you more coverage, and also how far in advance you get in touch with us is definitely effective for me, maybe less so for somebody who's working more in print media.
Great. I remember years ago somebody summed this up to me for me really clearly. There was like, what is it you're going to tell your mum about this? And it's not, we released a report.
One of the best tips I ever got for writing when I was writing in newspapers was that imagine a story. Imagine you see your friend across the street and you need to tell this person this story really succinctly, really quickly across a noisy street. What would you say to them? And that's always stuck in my head. So please think like that.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And Nicola, I'm not sure if this is something that you'll have come across in terms of Edinburgh Cat and Dog Home, but one of the difficulties that charities have is trying to get that balance between telling their story and not annoying funders and supporters. And that can be a really difficult balance to get. Is there times when you think it's better to just keep quiet, or should you shout out?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, certainly one that we battle with quite a lot at Edinburgh Dog and Cat Home. I think working in animal welfare, if there's anyone who's tuned in who works in animal welfare, you'll know it's a whole different beast. And the comms there's nothing quite like it in terms of animal welfare comes quite high emotions, and people have lots of different opinions on how animal welfare organisations should be run. So if we have a policy on something that we need to communicate that we know is going to divide opinions, for example, we need to weigh that up of, yeah, are we going to lose donors here? Are we going to lose supporters? But at the end of the day, we always try and go down that, what Gareth said earlier about that transparency line and be completely honest, because if you're doing your job well, you don't have anything to hide, and if people don't agree with that, then you know you're never going to please everybody. But yeah, I think it is a balancing act of going back to what I said earlier about thinking about why you're going to put a story out, and what's the purpose of it, what are you hoping to achieve from it, because if you're not going to achieve anything from it, there's probably not a reason to do it. So yeah, and again, I think it's thinking about what outlets you're gonna send it to, for what message that you're gonna put out there.
Yeah, Gareth, do you feel that charities are willing to speak out enough?
I think a lot of them are, and that has changed a little bit over the last couple of months, that saying that if we don't get funding in the next couple of months, then we could be at our future could be at risk. I think in the past, they definitely had more organisations getting in touch when it was almost too late, when they had weeks to go. And I think there are more organisations now who are willing to say that they're struggling. I think that's also to do maybe a little bit with the way that funders are changing as well, is that there seems to be a movement now from them to say that actually you don't have to tell us everything's all right if it isn't, or a project didn't work at the end, or a project worked at the end if it didn't. I think that honesty is the best policy when it comes to this, and you do just have to kind of think about it and kind of spend time thinking about how you want to communicate it. But at the end, it needs to be accurate and honest. And I think that's the organisations that best connect, not only with the media but with their supporters as well, as if they can be honest about how things are going and what the future holds, and also honest when things are going well as well.
Great. So we've got another question here submitted by Ryan Lightbody, who's asking about the use of press distribution services. Chris, do you pick up questions, news from press distribution services? Is it worth charities using?
Speaking someone who, I don't work in the news desk, so it might be that there are a lot of releases that do get through that way. So I can't really answer you. I give you a definitive answer on that. I certainly don't use them, but I'm a correspondent, I'm a reporter, so I wouldn't necessarily be plugged into that. I'd be focusing on one story at a time. So I'm sorry, I'm afraid that's a bit of a useless answer.
Fair enough. Nicola, do you have any thoughts? Have you ever tried to pitch a story to PA in the hope that it'll get picked up more widely?
We actually don't. We tend to send them directly to the journalists. However, we have had quite a few occasions where a story will have been picked up by an agency and they'll come to us asking for quotes and things. So we don't tend to go to them directly, but occasionally they do come to us looking to put a story out.
And Gareth, do you have any thoughts on this? Are you aware of?
Yeah, I mean, we get a lot of content through that comes through. Not quite what we'd think of as traditional press agencies, but more like the PR agencies, so people like Gorkana and stuff like that. And to be honest, so much of it is not relevant, especially in Scotland, that it tends to get ignored a bit. I have worked a little bit on the news desk in the past, in previous jobs, and I think that the bigger kind of national stories tended to come in on the wire, but local stuff didn't tend to at all. So I would say that generally, unless your organisation's working on something massive or you feel like you need support with it, then I wouldn't greatly think that you would need to work with any of these kind of organisations.
Thanks. Okay, well, we've got a strange, not a strange question, but one I'm not sure that many of you can answer, but I'm going to put it to Nicola. Stephanie Harverson is asking about whether or not there's a problem with journalists copying stories from social media to their own platforms without any communication to the charity and potentially miscommunicating the story. Have you seen that happen with any of your stories? And if so, what would you do about it?
Yeah, sometimes we quite often, particularly with animals that are up for rehoming or whatever, we'll find that Indra Live or Evening News will pick up themselves without getting in touch with us and post it, which is fantastic for us. But yeah, now and again, even though we've maybe been asked for a quote on something, we may not have seen or know what the full story is in advance, and there might be some misquoted information or information that isn't entirely true. I think it's just about having that relationship and that confidence to go back and say that's actually not accurate. Would you change that? And I think 9 times out of 10 there's not an issue with that. If, as Chris said, journalists don't want to be wrong. They don't want to put false information out there. So if it's something that's particularly, obviously if it's online, it's easy enough for them to go in and edit it generally. So it's just about having the confidence to say, can you change that? Actually, this is what it should be. And they're quite good at changing it.
Yeah, great. And Gareth, do you agree with that? If somebody gets back in touch with you and says that's not quite right, are you okay with that?
Well, certainly, yeah. Accuracy is absolutely key to everything we do. And the other thing is, if you get involved in a long, drawn-out correspondence of a complaint, it takes up so much time and it's stressful. It's really stressful. So you don't want to. It doesn't make anyone's lives better. Getting involved in sort of long-running disputes or kind of things like that. Accuracy is absolutely key. So yeah, we don't want to tell stories the wrong way.
Great. Obviously, journalists are only human and sometimes they do make mistakes, but it's good to hear Gareth, and I'm sure Chris would echo this, saying that they are willing to correct those mistakes. We've got one here about opinion pieces and columns. Chris, this won't be something you're doing at the BBC, but perhaps in your past you might know about what happens, whether or not news desks or journalism teams are open to receiving opinion pieces and columns and things.
I'm not really sure I understand the question. Is it? I mean, I don't know if it refers to the charity themselves doing opinion pieces, or whether or not you would like to get the attention of an opinion piece writer.
Probably either. I'm sure our audience would be keen to hear about either of those.
Well, yeah, I mean in terms of securing the opinion pieces, again, that's down to the news desk, and actually I would say it goes further than that. That would be down to like your feature editor or your editor, and it really depends on the organisation or the publication itself. So it could be, if it's a local newspaper, for example, it might be more open to having for example, a column by Edinburgh Cat and Dog Home. It might be that if there's a campaign that a national newspaper is doing, it might actually approach the charity to do it themselves. So there really is no hard and fast rule for that. What I would say about getting the attention of some of the big opinion piece writers, I mean, there's a lot of great writers in Scotland who do that sort of thing where it's an opinion, but it's also sort of news. So you get people like Danny Garavelli and Annie Brown's a great example at the Daily Record, who have columns and do write about things, but also do the news as well. And if you approach these people and you feel that your charity is doing work that would be of interest to people like that, contact them directly. I think that's probably the best thing to do. If it's somebody like Annie Brown or Danny Garavelli or someone like that, go straight to them and say, look, we're doing this work. It is something that you've written about in the past. Would you be interested in including us in a further opinion piece later further down the line? Because they might do that.
And Gareth, what are your thoughts on this about people wanting opinion pieces in TFN, for example?
Yeah, I suppose TFN is a wee bit different because we do run regular opinion pieces from organisations on a daily basis, and it is a really good way of getting an opinion piece out there as well. I think for a wider audience, it tends to, if you're looking for it in a newspaper, it'll tend to need to be in response to something that's already happened in terms of a story, or if it's a really big issue in the local area, that type of thing. I think it's quite difficult to pitch an opinion piece on the running of your organisation. I don't think there's that many. I think there's that many kind of spaces for that type of thing in newspapers anymore. But in TFN, we do always have a forum for that, and we're certainly always interested in hearing and seeing opinion pieces. And it might be even if you've got one for your own website, and just run it by us as well, and we can have a look at it, see if it fits. And just to mention columnists a wee bit, in terms of what Chris says, I think that there's, especially for some of the smaller charities, a lot of the time people writing these columns might not be aware of your work and what you do. So if you see a column that they've written and it fits in with what your organisation's ethos is, then just give them a shout and speak to them. And it might be that they can't feature you the next week, but the next time they're writing a piece on the issue, then they will be able to.
Yeah, that's really good advice. I mean, I think it's really important to remember that you should value what it is your organisation does, and recognise that journalists are generalists. They have to keep an awful lot of stuff in their head, and they're not necessarily going to be. They're very unlikely to be aware of your small, kind of fairly niche organisation. So don't assume that they've heard of you. Just feel, yeah, it's important to just tell them who you are. So we have touched on this question a bit already, but I'm just going to come back to you, Chris, in particular about it, which is how you feel about anonymous case studies. If it's a story, for example, like a domestic abuse story is one of the classic ones where people are really nervous about, and there may be safety reasons for why they don't feel they can be on television. Is there any occasions where you'll accept anonymous case studies or not?
We accept anonymous case studies all the time. It just depends on the subject really, and why they want to remain anonymous. So you used the example of domestic abuse survivors. They absolutely, we would never consider doing anything other than anonymous with them. Well, I wouldn't anyway, unless it's for years and years down the line, and potentially, unless it's for example, I'm thinking of a case, if somebody's been convicted and they're no longer if they're no longer at risk of them, then they might wish to waive their anonymity. But as standard, we'd probably tend to do that as anonymous. And actually, one of my colleagues, Emma Clifford Bell, actually did a really powerful piece through Women's Aid recently, where she interviewed two domestic abuse survivors who fled their home during lockdown, and it was really quite good. And actually, what she did in the end, was one allowed her own voice to be heard, while the other one we had someone else, like an actor or I think it was someone in the office, actually read her words for her. So that thing that works. So anonymous case studies are totally fine, depending on the subject. If somebody wants to remain anonymous for the sake of just not wanting to be on the telly, because if they feel a bit uncomfortable, then we probably wouldn't really go for that. But certainly, if it's somebody that is at risk, then we would definitely 100% make them anonymous. I'm actually just looking at the question here, and it mentions composite case studies as well. We wouldn't use a composite case study at all, because it's not a real person.
Great. Thanks. And Gareth, I take it you're okay with I think you maybe already said something about earlier being happy to use anonymous.
Yeah, it's just like what Chris says as well. It's dependent on, it's not something we would greatly use if it's an issue that didn't really merit someone being anonymous for. And I have to admit, one of my pet hates is if you've got a picture of someone who's an adult, not a child, and you only get your first name and they're only willing to give their first name to it. I think in terms of print media, like the the kind of rules are that you always, if you're identified, you're identified. And for adults, that's the way it should be done. But yeah, anonymous case studies are totally fine and can work really, really well for sort of like a lot of kind of serious type pieces. Can really back up strong messages, particularly around kind of abuse issues and things like that.
Great, thanks very much. Oh, Chris, have you got something else to add?
Yeah, I'm just going to add to Garrett's point there in terms of you know, that the seriousness and things like that. One of the questions we always get asked is when it comes to anonymous filming in particular is how we do it and how we would make sure that this person isn't identifiable. We work with really good camera operators and producers who have really great ideas on how to protect someone's anonymity and make sure that they're not identifiable to anybody. So when we say that we want to do something anonymously, there are really strong safeguarding measures in place. And also, as I said before, we also have that informed consent thing as well that makes sure that people know what they're getting into. So it's absolutely raise the concerns about it, but we are pretty good at that kind of thing.
Great, thank you very much. And I think that's really helpful for people on this webinar to know. So Nicola, I'm going to pick up on some of the social media stuff you said earlier. Somebody has asked, Karen Bradford has asked how important social media is to making roads with raising your profile. I think we've answered whether journalists check their social media. They clearly do. But I thought it was interesting what you were saying earlier about the fact that because you had staff on furlough, you didn't have a lot of time, you seem to be focusing on social media more than on other things. Was that the area that you felt was the most important?
Yeah, I think for us it was, but I think it's going to be different for every charity because it depends on what your cause is. Your beneficiaries are going to be completely different. Your supporters are going to be completely different. So it's going back to that, looking at your data if you have it, and looking at who your key audience are, and are they on social media? If they are they on Facebook? Are they on Twitter? Are they on Instagram? Are they on TikTok? You might want a mixture of all of those, or it might be actually that if you've got a slightly older demographic that you just stick to Facebook and you do that really well. But yeah, it all comes down to the resource you've got in-house and how much time you actually have to spend, because social media can become a bit of a beast when you're trying to cover all areas. We're fortunate that we have a full-time digital officer, but even with that, we have our kennel and cattery teams taking video for us, taking photos for us, and we have our fundraisers doing all of that as well. So there's actually a lot of resource that we put into that. And if you're not fortunate enough to have a comms person in your team and you're doing comms alongside a million other things, then it can get really tricky to do social media really well. So I think just look at, if you can only do one, look at where your audience are. If it's a young audience that you're attracting, maybe you want to look at something like TikTok, where go where your audience are really, and try and put your resource there. And if you don't have a lot of resource in-house, look and see if you have a little bit of budget that you could put towards a social media agency, because actually they can be quite a cost-effective way of putting your social message out there if you can't do it in-house. So they're always worth looking at as well.
That's a really interesting point, actually. And what about, do you pay for sponsored content, or do you rely on your own supporters?
It depends on what message we're putting out. If it's promoting a dog or a cat that's up for rehoming, pretty much always organic, because it gets a lot of traffic. People love the imagery, people love talking about the dog or cat. If it's a fundraising message or an event, we don't tend to get a lot of organic traffic on that, so we need to put a little bit of budget behind it. But I think people sometimes can think that putting a sponsored ad up needs to cost a lot of money. It doesn't. We can put £10 behind an advert and it can make a bit of a difference. I just think it depends on what your objectives are and what reach you want. Obviously, if it's a huge event and you want huge reach, then you need to be more realistic with your budget and put a fair whack behind it. But if it's just to get a little bit of traffic on a post and get some attention, £5-10 can sometimes be enough to get that traffic. But I think again it goes back to, depends on what your charity is and what your message is. If it's a subject matter that people find really engaging, then you might do really well with organic. But if it's something you're really trying to market, a lot of the time you might need to put a bit of budget behind your post.
And do you put budget behind fundraising stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. Usually without fail. Sometimes we'll start off with an organic post and leave it for a few days, and when it's not getting the right reach, we'll put a boost on it. But we tend to budget when we're doing our budgets for the year for every event and every campaign. We work out our social media budget at that time, just the way we would with print or anything else. I think just because you can do it for free, the algorithms and the way that social media works these days is realistically, if you want to get a huge reach, more often than not, you're going to have to put a bit of advertising budget behind it.
Great, thank you very much. So we've only got 5 minutes left, so I thought I would give everybody a bit of a chance to sum up. But one little question that's just come in that I thought is quite interesting is also about how you feel about stories that have been covered elsewhere, maybe slightly differently, and whether or not you need something to be unique to you. So you maybe want to give us a wee answer to that, Chris, and then give us a wee sum up of what your sort of top tips would be, and then we'll move on. And
the answer to that is it doesn't have to be unique, as long as it's important, as long as people are it's something that merits people's attention. Then it could be that, I mean, every journalist wants to do something that's unique and pushes the story on and get the scoop and all that kind of thing. But the reality is, it's you're not going to get that every single day. You're not going to get that every single story. So if I'm doing something on, potentially the drugs death crisis is a great example. That's not a new story. Everybody's been covering this issue for a long time. But even if it's not a new story, it's still important to continue to do it. So if your work is still ongoing and it's important work, we will definitely be interested. In terms of the tips, as I said before, it's all about building relationships with particular journalists and journalists that you think would be ideal to cover your piece if it's something that they would be interested in. Understanding what a news organisation, be it newspaper, radio, be it online or broadcast, what they're looking for, and really understanding what would work for them. And it might not be the same for newspapers as it is for television. And also just reaching out when you think that the work you're doing is important and needs attention.
sorry, great, thank you very much. I forgot to unmute myself there for a moment. You'd think 9 months into COVID, I wouldn't make that rookie mistake. Nicola, what's your
top tips for me, honestly, is probably just not overthink it. Keep it simple. If you have a good story, don't feel scared to pick up the phone or drop an email to a journalist. I think, Susan, you said earlier that journalists are only human and they're just doing their job, and actually you're helping them to do their job by giving them stories. So just to build those relationships and remember that it's not some scary monster at the other end of the phone or the email. It's just another person that's hopefully able to help you. So build those relationships, but don't be scared of speaking to the media.
And Gareth, what about you?
Just pick up exactly what Chris and Nicola have said. Really, tell your story, tell it well, don't overcomplicate it. Nicola actually made a good point just a couple of minutes ago about people who might be working in a role where comms isn't greatly what they've done before, or it's maybe not their main skill. If that's the case, pick a few different formats that you want to get your message out in, and keep it simple. I think, and if you focus getting your story to different people and different audiences, don't just tell it as one generic big story.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. That's us at 3 o'clock. So thank you very much to Chris, Nicola and Gareth. You've been an absolutely great panel and done great work answering these some very particular questions and some quite overarching questions. Thank you very much to everybody who attended. I realised that I forgot to mention at the start that this webinar is part of our series of webinars for Never More Needed, which is a UK-wide campaign to document and debate the role of charities in the voluntary sector in society during COVID. So if you haven't heard much about Nevermore Needed and would like to get involved, check out the scvo.org.uk/Nevermore Needed. There's some advice there about how to tell your stories generally, and some resources that you can download to help promote your organisation and the work that you've been doing during coronavirus. So thank you very much to everyone for attending. Once again, thank you very much to the panel. And as a reminder, you can view this webinar again on the SCVO website after the event, and so you can share it with colleagues if you found it useful. Okay, goodbye.